Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sherri Fink, New York Times, Arpa Garay, President, Global Pharmaceuticals, Commercial Analytics, Digital Marketing, Merck & Co., Inc., and Michael Nyenhuis, President and CEO, UNICEF USA.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're here today to discuss a really important topic, a very timely topic, which is advancing COVID solutions through collaborations. And the only way to get out of the acute phase of this pandemic, of course, is with partnerships and everybody pulling together. We have a distinguished group of speakers today. They include on the stage here with me, Jay Collins, the Vice Chair of Banking, Capital Markets Advisory at Citi. We have Michael Nyenhuis, President and CEO of UNICEF USA. And then virtually over there, we have Arpa Garay, the President, Global Pharmaceuticals, Commercial Analytics, Digital Marketing. Everybody has a long title at Merck.
I know.
These are very important people. And I'm Sherri Fink, as you heard. So we're going to discuss this very important topic today, and I think it's important to talk about both the accomplishments, because it is a triumph of science and also partnership and supply and finance and every sector, that we now have some tools that can protect us very effectively, vaccines, certain therapeutics, from the worst outcomes of this disease. And as a medical reporter, I've spent much of the last 2 years in hospitals seeing the worst outcomes, and we're getting to such high levels of death from this pandemic. So we know these are absolutely critical tools. So on the one hand, we have positive examples. On the other hand, we are sitting today, it's the UN General Assembly. Tomorrow, the White House will have a summit on COVID, and it is really, one person from the WHO said today, an inflection point, because there is non-equitable distribution of these really, really critical life-saving and disease-saving tools. And I just want to start to kick us off with some statistics that actually Michael Nyenhuis' organization sent out today in a release to time with these global convenings. They said that millions of frontline health workers in low-income countries and the families they serve are unvaccinated, that the vast majority of vaccines have been bought up by the richest countries, and less than 2% of people in low-income countries have received even their first dose of these vaccines. UNICEF called it, this inequity is an intolerable injustice putting us all at risk. And that is because it's not just a humanitarian cause, but in fact, we are all linked, and we'll talk about that. The evolution of the virus, the new variants that could emerge, the collective global economy, we all have an interest in getting the terrible acute phase of this pandemic under control. And also UNICEF has pointed out, and hopefully I'm not stealing your statistics, that of some commitments that were made earlier this summer by wealthier countries, only 12% of the commitments on the additional 1 billion vaccines that were supposed to be supplied, pledged to low and middle income countries, have been actually supplied at this point. And then one more statistic, if these weren't convincing enough on the global inequity side, from WHO just the other day, that more than 5.7 billion vaccine doses have been administered globally, enough to really hit, if they were delivered equitably, to be given to the people at highest risk. However, high-income countries have administered 61 times more doses per inhabitant than low-income countries. So we're going to talk today about both the accomplishments and about some of these very critical inequities and what we need to learn from them, both in the moment and for the future. So I would like to start with Jay Collins. Asking a question. So you're from Citi, and people might wonder what you have how you've been involved in these global efforts, and I will let you talk a bit about that. And I think let's start with the current moment in these very, very, critical statistics that we've just heard, and what needs to happen. And from your perspective and your involvement, tell us a bit more about this global effort to vaccinate the world.
Sure. So first, with the first part of your question, City's been honored since October of 2020 to be the risk and financial advisor to Gavi and the COVAX facility.
And tell us what COVAX is for those who don't know.
So for those of you that don't know, COVAX is the multilateral organization that was established to ensure just and equitable distribution of vaccines to the poorest countries in the world. It has contracted on behalf of those countries 4.4 billion vaccines to be distributed between now and the end of 2022. It raised $10 billion for that effort, in large part thanks to the efforts of the Biden administration, both in the fundraising and the $4 billion that the Biden administration gave to COVAX. Dose sharing, critical component of that. And ultimately, at this point, COVAX is likely to be able to distribute 1.2 billion vaccines this year, by the end of this year. Importantly, vaccinating 20% of the population of the 91 poorest countries in the world. That said, COVAX has, and this gets to your point about some of the challenges, COVAX has distributed 300 million vaccines so far to 141 million countries, but because of the numbers that UNICEF has mentioned, the wealthiest countries in the world contracted fast and furiously ahead of COVAX, and therefore a large part of the first part of this year's supply was contracted by the wealthiest countries. COVAX has been an extraordinary experience for us at City, watching from the outside of perhaps the most complex private-public partnership that the world has seen since a war, right? Partners like UNICEF, PAHO, WHO, but also, if you imagine, all of the countries in the world that have contracted with COVAX, and then all of the suppliers of vaccines coming together with the regulatory community, global and local participants of the healthcare community. And it's been done, it's a little bit like building a plane as you're flying it, right? It was pretty much created, other than the extraordinary 20 years of experience of Gavi, it was done almost from scratch. So it's still very much work in process, and when we go around, I can tell you a little bit more what needs to be done more going forward.
Okay, thanks. Yes, a very complex effort, surely, but yes, we do need to talk about what needs to happen and what needs to change so that it could be, this type of an effort could be more successful in the future in terms of achieving its goals, its very laudable goals. I'm going to go to our virtual participant, Arpa Garay, next with Merck. So Merck has had a few roles, and we will talk actually about therapeutics next, because you are developing a potential therapeutic for the pandemic, and these vaccines are talked about a lot, but in fact there are all of these other tools. Countries need oxygen, countries need, there are tools, antiviral drugs, antibodies, monoclonal antibodies that could be very, very useful in this fight to prevent death. Again, a lot of inequity in those efforts, and so we will hear a bit about, well, let's start with that actually, since I've raised it. I saw that Merck is developing a drug that it hopes will be successful. What would it take to make sure that that drug could be equitably distributed and not just end up like all of the other drugs that where some countries have access and some really have almost no access?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think just listening to all the statistics you opened with, it's so important. I think the importance of the therapeutics is now coming even more to the forefront because we've got large pockets of low vaccination rates. We've got a lot of, even within developing countries, pockets of low vaccination rates due to vaccines confidence. We are seeing an increase in variants around the world. So the need for a therapeutic that can be administered when a patient tests positive for COVID or has COVID symptoms has become increasingly important to us. So we're currently in a partnership with Ridgeback Therapeutics. We are in phase 3 trials for an oral antiviral. And in terms of sort of the equitable access, broad affordable access has been one of the fundamental pillars of our entire approach to developing and commercializing this product. We have signed multiple agreements with generic companies in India to ensure that low and middle income countries have access to the therapy as soon as it is authorized or approved. We're also working closely to manage supply across different countries and working closely with governments. The US government procurement was one of the announcements that we made earlier this year, but we continue to work across both governments, our voluntary license partners, as well as we are in conversations with the Medicines Patent Pool, as well as the ACT Accelerator. So this notion of broad, equitable, affordable access is really fundamental to how we're approaching this, especially given all the statistics that you started with and the real sort of humanitarian as well as global public health need that exists today.
And just to go further on that, why is it that other products haven't been equitably, like what are the barriers to that happening? And tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of barriers, right? One is just, I would say, manufacturing. So as you think about some of the vaccines and some of the other more complex large molecules, there are fewer partners that you can actually work with on the generic side to create some of these voluntary licensing opportunities. I'd say from an access perspective, the product that we're working on is orally administered. That is a huge benefit as you think about developing world and lack of access to hospitals and lack of access to infusion centers. And so I think, you know, as you think about the manufacturing complexities, the supply chain complexities of many of these other products that require cold chain, for example, and you couple that with the route of administration, something that's more sort of stable, orally available, and could benefit someone in the outpatient setting to prevent them from going into the hospital can be a real game changer in terms of curbing the pandemic.
So it's the product design as well. And then I'll just ask you one more before we go to Michael, which is Merck has also been involved in helping to produce vaccines for COVID, the J&J vaccine. And I wanted to ask you, one of the big calls right now for this summit and for UNGA and looking forward to try to address this inequity, there are more and more calls for vaccine companies to be transparent about, you know, their order sheets. So, you know, who's in the queue, in what order. There's suspicion that the low-income countries have been put at the back of the line because they're paying less. And I'm curious, just how come, what makes it hard for a company like yours, for example, or a vaccine producer to actually just be open with their order sheets? And could that be done? Yeah. Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, I think that's an important question to think about for the future. If you think about this pandemic in particular, there's been a lot of complexities in terms of predicting supply by country. There's been complexities in actually securing advanced purchase agreements and commitments that were made, you know, earlier to certain governments versus others. There have also been some sort of ups and downs in terms of partnerships and production capabilities. So I think going forward, it's more of, I would say, on the public health community, including the industry, to set out more ambitious goals on broad, affordable access and find a better way to manage how that is possible versus, you know, potentially just having an open sort of communication on the order sheets, as things are very dynamic as we speak. and even predicting the supply and the rate of infections around the world over the last 18 months has been very, very difficult.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure that we save some time for Michael Nyenhuis. So UNICEF has been very involved in this effort, COVAX, and one of the big things that you guys are doing, as I understand it, is preparing countries to be able to use the vaccines when they finally do come. And it seems that some of the financing for that has been made available but hasn't been a lot of countries haven't accessed it, and I'm curious why that is and what you see as the challenge and the opportunities to prepare countries for the vaccines.
Yeah, it seems to me there are three big things that need to happen for this to work. One is you need the R&D and the production of the vaccines. You need supply chain, and there's a financing piece, obviously, and you need local readiness. So that's everything from the health centers and cold chain to training for vaccinators to dealing with vaccine hesitancy in those communities as well. And that piece is just as important as all the others. And that's not where the majority of the funding from multilaterals and from governments have gone to. In fact, here at UNICEF, we have raised a lot of private resources from private philanthropists, foundations, corporations to help fund that piece of work. But there's a lot of that needs to go on, and I think it's maybe the piece that is not thought of first. And all the rest of it can happen, but if you haven't done that piece of it, it's the last mile, nothing's going to happen in the end.
Mm-hmm. And so we really need to focus on that. With our last few seconds, I know we wanted to finish, Jay Collins, with just a little bit more. One of the big problems at the beginning, and you and I were talking about this ahead of time, was that all the wealthy countries kind of snapped up a lot of the contracts and made purchases before this instrument that was being built as it was being flown could raise the money or have the financing ability to buy those doses. And that's part of why they seem to be at the end of the line. So tell us just what's your perspective on that? What needs to change in the future to prevent that from happening?
So first, before the future is right now, one, we do need more transparency, as you called for, from the manufacturers, so that there isn't waste, so that there can be planning on the ground, so that all the work that the likes of UNICEF do to prepare the way are done. But importantly, also to ensure that the poorest countries on the planet aren't put at the back of the queue, and that's critical. Second is more dose sharing. More dose sharing, and the mechanics in the system has to work and continue to be improved there. And importantly, also think about it as the person in the airport that runs up to you and wants to go to the front of the line because they're going to miss their plane, and you let them go. We call that queue swapping. But we need countries that have enough vaccines, that have reached a threshold or can't distribute in a timely way their vaccines, to share and to essentially allow suppliers to deliver to the poorest countries through COVAX those vaccines in a timely way. And then, quite frankly, everything that the White House is doing tomorrow that you already pointed to of raising the awareness that this is no longer just about just distribution and a humanitarian cause, but the variants, we are in a race against the variants. This will get worse. There's a likelihood that this petri dish of vaccines plus the COVID virus will mutate or have a super variant at a certain point if we don't eliminate it. And so we're not
safe. Don't have enough vaccines going out.
We need to have the vaccines distributed to the poorest countries to prevent them coming back to the US, for example, with stronger variants. So raising the awareness of the urgency, raising the awareness of the inequitable distribution, and importantly, again, funding in scale more vaccines for the population of the world.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask if there's
yes.
30 seconds left for Arpa Garay and Michael Nyenhuis to just make any last points.
I'll just make one comment, which is that equity is a beautiful idea, but when it bumps up against self-interest, it's a very complicated one, and we have to somehow wrestle with the fact that those of us who are in positions of privilege and in these sorts of, in the countries where we live, that we have to put down some of our self-interest to make this a really, truly global cause.
And should there be some sort of global instrument like a treaty that would sort of force the hands of everybody to play fair?
We need something that we didn't have before, because it didn't really work this time around. And so we really need to think carefully about how do we structure this differently, how does the global community work together differently going forward, because this will happen again, whether it's another variant or another virus.
And Arpa Garay, any last words from you? And thank you for providing some sort of ideas for what companies could do to expand equity. Anything else you want to add?
Just a comment for future pandemics. I think this pandemic has shown the importance and the need for global stakeholders to really work together to start building, safe and effective and off-the-shelf antivirals with broad activity across pathogens, so that we are ready for the next pandemic and not responding or reacting to the next one.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us today.